Hello, Grade 5. Welcome back to your social studies for this week. This is the last thing we're going to cover this week. We're going to talk a little bit about the story of immigration and the Great Migration to Canada. So I hope you have your highlighters ready and you have your booklets out and you're following along. All right, we are going to start right up here at the top. Right up here. We're just going to read through this together now. So, the story of immigration runs through Canadian history for over 300 years. It is a story of courage and determination in which the real heroes were the hundreds of thousands of humble and obscure men and women who faced hazards by land and sea, in the hope that they would find better homes and a fuller life for themselves and their children. All right, we will start. We're not going to highlight any of that. I will scroll down just so that we can have a full page to be highlighting here. All right. So we're going to learn about migration, what it took for people to move over to Canada, the hardships they went through, the trials, the things that happened in order for them to find a better life in a better new land. So, the Great Migration. The Great Migration, which began in 1815, left its indelible mark on British North America. So it began in 1815. Part of this migration, of this Great Migration, went to Australia and New Zealand, but by far the larger part came to North America, to the British provinces and the United States. So that whole sentence we will highlight. So part of the Great Migration went to Australia and New Zealand, but the larger part came to North America, so to the British provinces in Canada and United States. Emigration was a great act of faith and endurance for any individual or family. It meant lifelong separation from loved ones, friends, familiar scenes, and was not undertaken lightly. Usually, immigration was taken up for various reasons, such as adventurism, economic opportunity, so that means work, maybe gold rushes or the like, as well as religious, political, or legal persecution. So that means people are doing bad things to them for political, religious, or other reasons. Deportation, so they got kicked out of their country. Economic hardship, so they're poor, they're not doing so well. Sickness and plague. So those ones are self-explanatory, but there were a lot of reasons. So we're going to underline those reasons. So that long sentence we just read, we're going to highlight. And again, I am just underlining because that's all I have access to do. The single major and most important cause of the enormous migration that occurred was starvation, caused by the failure of the potato crop in Ireland and partly in Scotland. So, we're going to go back here and we're going to highlight for most important cause that occurred was starvation, caused by the failure of the potato crop in Ireland and partly in Scotland. So the largest part of this migration came due to starvation. From 1846 to 1852, The potato crop in Ireland fell to blight, and the Irish starved. Poorhouses were filled to capacity. Soup kitchens could not feed the hungry. Cholera and typhus broke out. So those are sicknesses. Hundreds of thousands died. Emigration was the only hope. 2 million Irish fled their homeland, and another million are believed to have died trying. So 2 million, we're going to highlight, fled their homes, and another million are believed to have died trying. So 3 million total. Hundreds of thousands came to Canada. So we're going to highlight that as well. Okay. So, moving on to the next paragraph. Land was the lure which drew settlers across the sea, and North America had millions of unoccupied acres. So, North America had a lot of land that was not occupied by anyone. So, that was the draw. People wanted to go there. Land was the lure, and North America had millions of unoccupied acres. A lure is something you catch a fish with. So you cast your line out, catch a fish with the lure. So, what was causing people to want to move to Canada? Well, the lure was the land. Okay, there was a lot of land. North America was also closer to the British Isles than Australia, and the expense of the journey was far less, and emigrants felt they were not going so far from the homeland that they were leaving. So North America was closer than Australia was. So they figured, oh, we'll go there. It's cheaper. It's easier to get there. It's not as far from where we live, or where we came from. In the last sentence, between 1815 and 1850, not less than 800,000 people came to British North America. Not less than 800,000 people came to British North America. So, that's all highlighting for that page. So that means more than 800,000 people came to British North America, that's Canada or the United States, in order to survive, in order to have a new life, to have a better life. All right, we're going to move on to the next page. So my highlights are going to disappear, just remember. Let's see if I can get the, oh no, we'll scroll down a bit after. Okay. Continuing on. Another reason for such a great movement of British people was a return of peace in 1815. So we're going to underline that, or highlight that, sorry. The previous 40 years, Britain had been at war, and war discourages emigration. So war discourages emigration. Now that they were at peace, they were able to leave, were able to emigrate to Canada, to the US. Following war, conditions changed. Unemployment and hardship swept through Europe and the British Isles, and masses of miserable people began to look overseas for relief. An increase in commerce after 1815 was another reason for the migration, and the 1830s and 1840s saw a rapid increase in communication. So, an increase in commerce after 1815. Commerce is business and work. Was a reason for the migration, and the 1830s and 40s saw a rapid increase in communication, so it was easier to communicate from amongst people and amongst nations. More larger ships crossed the Atlantic. Newspapers increased, as did the amount of mail sent back and forth. And this exchange of news encouraged many to follow friends and family who had already emigrated. So, again, the increase in communication caused much more to follow friends and family overseas. Land agents with land to sell in the colonies aroused interest through advertisements and descriptions of opportunities in the New World. The causes of the Great Migration touched, in fact, almost every important aspect of the life of the period. So, the causes of this migration touched almost every important aspect of the life of the period. So, migrating helped their lives in almost every aspect. So, that was the reason why people were doing it. It was helping their lives. It was helping them to have a better life, new land, and a new start. So, moving on. 14% of the British migration were Scottish. So a lot of Scottish people were moving over. The emigrants and their hazards. Okay, I'm actually going to scroll down here because this is the last section of our reading today. So we can get this all in. Perfect. The ocean voyage was itself a dangerous venture. So this was very dangerous, traveling on the boats, traveling on the ships over to Canada. Scores of immigrants packed onto Canadian timber ships that otherwise would have made an empty and unprofitable return home to their Canadian port. These coffin ships, with poor ventilation and no sanitary conditions, were entirely unsuitable for passengers. So, this is very important. These ships that passengers were traveling on were so unclean, they were dirty, they had no ventilation, well, poor ventilation, sorry, and they were just so unsafe for people to be passengers on. I'll continue. People were crammed to more than double the normal passenger load below deck in overcrowded bunks. More than double the normal passenger load below deck. Can you believe that? If one bed was for one person, there would be two people there. That is how many people they stuffed into these ships. Conditions were bad in good weather, but in bad weather, everyone would be cooped up, and the misery was extreme. So, in bad weather, they all had to go below deck, so they had to cram everyone down there. And it was very terrible life for them. Captains were supposed to supply water and bread, but many did not even do what the law required. So, captains were supposed to supply them with water and bread, but many did not do that. So they were, again, not getting what they needed in order to survive. Passengers were expected to provide most of their own food, and not infrequently they brought too little. So most of the time they didn't bring enough food for themselves, which was a major issue. Refrigeration and tinned foods were unknown. At this time they didn't have fridges, they didn't have canned food. They didn't have tuna in a can that you could eat out of. Disease often broke out on these crowded vessels, and the conditions became so bad that descriptions of immigrant ships written at the time seemed almost unbelievable. So, disease often broke out on the crowded ships, and conditions became so bad that anyone who wrote about these ships, the reader would say, well, I don't believe you. That can't be right. That is how bad it was. People did not believe what they were hearing about these ships. Added to these hazards were shipwrecks, so sometimes there would be crashes. This last sentence is very important to understand how terrible it was and how bad it was for these people coming over. 20 to 45% of the immigrants died on the coffin ships or shortly after they arrived to their new home. 20 to 45% of the people on those ships will have died there, or shortly after landing and having a new home, they will die. They would die. So, what do you think about life on these ships? If you are an immigrant coming over to Canada, or British North America at the time, how would you like this trip? This trip would not be very enjoyable, I don't think. Very little food, very little water, more than double the allowed passengers, diseases, dirty, crammed in like a can of sardines. There would be shipwrecks, and almost half of you would die. It is crazy to think about how terrible or how hard it was for these immigrants to come over to Canada. And there were a lot of them. If you think about that number, if we scroll back, if we go back to the previous page, more than 800,000 people came to British North America. Does that account for all the deaths too? Well, you can say 20 to 45% would have died on their trip. So, lots to think about, but that is the end of the video for today. Next week we'll pick up, we'll continue our books, and we'll continue our highlighting. So, have a great weekend. I hope you are learning a lot. Before you go and share this with someone that you know. A family member, a friend, someone close by that you know. Tell them how hard it was for these immigrants to come to Canada and all the things that they went through.